Harlow Kensington tightened her apron and exhaled a slow, steady breath as she stared at the wilting roses in the display case. Another order canceled. Another day without enough customers. Another reminder that her beloved flower shop, Bloom and Vine, was barely holding on by a thread. The bell above the door jingled and she quickly straightened, forcing a smile onto her face. But the moment her eyes landed on the man stepping inside, her breath hitched. He didn't belong here, not in her little shop with its creaky wooden floors and floral, scented air. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His sharp, chiseled features were framed by dark blonde hair, and his piercing green eyes swept over the shop with a look of calculated interest. "Can I help you?" Harlow asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man's lips quirked slightly, not quite a smile, not quite anything at all. "I'm looking for the owner," he said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Harlow Kensington," her stomach twisted. "That's me." He extended a hand. "Grayson Lancaster." The name alone sent a jolt through her. Everyone in the city knew who he was. CEO of Lancaster Enterprises. A man who built his empire by acquiring struggling businesses and turning them into gold mines. "What do you want?" she asked, crossing her arms. The corner of his mouth lifted in something dangerously close to amusement. Straight to the point. "I like that." He glanced around the shop again before meeting her gaze. "I'm here to discuss your shop's future." Her pulse pounded. "What about it?" He slid a sleek folder onto the counter. "Bloom and Vine is in trouble, Harlow. Your debts are piling up, and at this rate you'll be forced to close within the next few months." She stiffened. "That's none of your business." "It is now," he said smoothly, "because I'm buying it." Silence crashed between them. Harlow's heart slammed against her ribs as she opened the folder and scanned the offer inside. It was generous, too generous. But that didn't change the fact that this was her dream, her life's work. She looked up, fire in her eyes. "I'm not selling." Grayson arched a brow. "You might not have a choice." She clenched her jaw. "I built this shop from the ground up. I won't let some corporate shark waltz in and take it from me." His expression remained unreadable. "I don't want to take it from you, Harlow. I want to save it." A bitter laugh escaped her. "And why would you do that?" He leaned forward, resting his hands on the counter. "Because I see potential, and because I don't make bad investments." Harlow's head spun. She wanted to believe he had some ulterior motive, that he was just another ruthless businessman looking for a quick profit. But there was something in his gaze, something steady, unwavering. "You'd really keep the shop running?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said without hesitation, "under one condition." She narrowed her eyes. "And what's that?" "You stay on as the manager." Her breath caught. "Why?" Grayson's gaze flickered over her, assessing her in a way that made her skin prickle. "Because you know this shop better than anyone, and because I want to see what you can do with the right resources." Harlow hesitated. Everything in her screamed to fight back, to refuse. But deep down, she knew the truth: she couldn't save Bloom and Vine on her own. And maybe, just maybe, Grayson Lancaster wasn't the enemy after all. She inhaled sharply, then exhaled. "Fine. But if you try to turn this place into some soulless chain, I walk." His lips twitched. "Deal." As they shook hands, an unexpected current of electricity shot through her. She ignored it, telling herself this was just business. But deep down, something told her this was only the beginning. The papers were signed. The deal was done. Harlow stood in the center of Bloom and Vine, staring at the shop as if seeing it for the first time. The ownership had changed, yet everything looked the same: the mismatched wooden shelves, the soft glow of fairy lights along the windows, the scent of fresh lavender and eucalyptus in the air. But beneath the familiarity, there was an undeniable shift. This was no longer just hers. And the man responsible for that shift stood across from her, his presence as commanding as ever. Grayson Lancaster had wasted no time asserting control. The ink on their contract had barely dried before he'd arranged for an efficiency audit of the shop. A team of analysts had come in that morning, assessing every inch of the business, from inventory to marketing strategies. Harlow had bristled at the intrusion, but she had agreed to this. She had chosen to fight for Bloom and Vine instead of watching it wither away. If that meant dealing with Grayson's relentless approach to business, so be it. Still, she hadn't expected him to stay the entire day, watching everything unfold with an intensity that made her nerves tighten. "You're glaring," his voice cut through the quiet, pulling her from her thoughts. She crossed her arms. "I'm observing." His expression remained unreadable as he leaned against the counter. "And what have you observed? That you don't trust me to run my own shop." His gaze flickered with something unreadable. "I wouldn't have kept you on if I didn't trust your skills, Harlow. But businesses don't run on passion alone. You need structure, strategy." She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "I know that. I've been running this place for years. And now you'll be running it with resources you didn't have before," he countered. "I'm not here to take away what makes this shop special. I'm here to make sure it survives." Harlow studied him, searching for any sign of deception, but there was none. He meant what he said, even if his delivery was about as soft as a brick wall. The front door opened, and a familiar face stepped inside. Mrs. Ellison, one of her most loyal customers, clutched her handbag as she took in the scene. Her gaze landed on Grayson, and her brows lifted slightly. "New staff?" she asked, glancing between them. Harlow hesitated. "Not exactly." "I own the shop now," Grayson said smoothly. "Mrs. Ellison blinked, then turned to Harlow. "Is that true?" Harlow nodded. For a moment, the older woman said nothing. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she looked back at Grayson. "Well, I hope you understand what you've gotten yourself into. This place is special." Grayson met her gaze without hesitation. "I do." Something in his tone made Harlow's stomach twist in an unfamiliar way. Mrs. Ellison hummed approvingly and turned back to Harlow. "I need a bouquet for my granddaughter's recital." "Something cheerful." Harlow welcomed the distraction, moving to gather the freshest blooms. As she worked, she felt Grayson's presence beside her. He was watching, studying the way she selected each flower with precision and care. "What's the significance of those?" he asked as she added a cluster of yellow tulips. She hesitated before answering. "They symbolize happiness and encouragement, perfect for a recital." A flicker of interest crossed his face. "You choose flowers based on meaning, always." She met his gaze. "Flowers aren't just decoration, they tell stories." Grayson didn't reply, but something shifted in his expression. Mrs. Ellison paid for her bouquet and left, leaving them alone once more. Grayson spoke first. "There's a gala tomorrow night, a charity event for business leaders in the city." Harlow frowned. "And I want you to come with me," she blinked. "Why?" "Networking," he said simply. "If we want Bloom and Vine to thrive, we need to expand its reach. The right connections could bring in high-end clients." Harlow hesitated. The idea of stepping into Grayson's world, surrounded by powerful executives who viewed businesses as transactions, unsettled her. But she had agreed to this partnership. And if she wanted to protect what she had built, she had to be willing to fight for it. "Fine," she said, "but don't expect me to play the corporate puppet." Grayson's lips twitched slightly. "I wouldn't dream of it." Something in his gaze made her stomach tighten again. She told herself it was nothing. But deep down, she knew their arrangement was about to become far more complicated than she had ever anticipated. Harlow had expected the gala to be overwhelming, but she wasn't prepared for the sheer extravagance of it all. The ballroom was a vision of opulence, crystal chandeliers hanging from the domed ceiling, a string quartet playing softly in the background, and waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne in delicate flutes. The air smelled of expensive perfume and polished ambition. Grayson had sent a car to pick her up, insisting that she arrive in style. She had nearly refused, but practicality won out. Now she stood at the entrance, feeling as though she had stepped into another world. The dress he had arranged for her, a sleek navy gown that hugged her in all the right places, was unlike anything she owned. The fabric shimmered under the light, and the slit along her leg made her feel both exposed and powerful. She wasn't sure if the confidence came from the dress or from the way Grayson looked at her when he first saw her in it. His gaze had been sharp, lingering, as if he hadn't expected her to look like this. Now, standing at his side, she felt the weight of curious stares. The crowd parted effortlessly for him, people greeting him with polite nods and murmured admiration. He had told her this was about networking, about securing high-end clientele for Bloom and Vine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more. "Relax," Grayson murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. His hand brushed the small of her back, a fleeting touch, but enough to send a jolt through her. "You belong here." She wasn't sure if that was true, but hearing him say it made it easier to hold her head high. They moved through the crowd, stopping occasionally as Grayson introduced her to key figures, executives, designers, influential socialites. She handled each interaction with careful precision, ensuring she didn't come across as intimidated. A woman approached them, her fitted black dress and diamond earrings a clear indication of her status. Her eyes flicked from Grayson to Harlow with quiet curiosity before she extended a hand. "So, this is the woman who has Grayson Lancaster attending charity galas with an actual date," she mused. Harlow accepted the handshake, maintaining an easy smile. "Harlow Kensington." The woman's lips twitched as if she found something amusing. "Millionaire Hayes, I own one of the largest event planning firms in the city." She turned back to Grayson. "You never mentioned you were in the floral business now." Grayson's expression remained unreadable. "I invest in potential," Millionaire hummed in response. "And what do you think, Harlow? Is your shop thriving under his influence, or is he turning it into another one of his empires?" Harlow met the woman's gaze head-on. "Bloom and Vine isn't just a business to me, it has a soul. And if Grayson had plans to strip it of that, I wouldn't be standing here." Alina's eyes gleamed with interest. "I like you," she admitted. "Perhaps we should talk about floral arrangements for my next event." Grayson tilted his head slightly. "You usually work with established floral companies." Alina smiled. "Maybe I'm in the mood for something different." As she walked away, Harlow exhaled slowly. She had just secured a potential high-profile client, but she couldn't ignore the tension thrumming beneath the surface. Grayson was watching her, his expression unreadable. "You handled that well," he said. She lifted a brow. Surprised, his lips curved slightly. "Not at all." Before she could respond, another voice interrupted. "Grayson, I was beginning to think you weren't coming." Harlow turned to see a man approaching, his tailored suit impeccable, his demeanor polished yet calculating. He extended a hand to Grayson, who shook it with a firm nod. "Daniel," Grayson acknowledged. Daniel's eyes flicked to Harlow, assessing her. "And who might this be?" "Harlow Kensington," Grayson introduced without hesitation. "She owns the flower shop I recently invested in." Daniel's brows lifted. "Interesting. You don't usually get involved in businesses that aren't scalable." Harlow stiffened, but before she could respond, Grayson spoke. "Not everything is about scale," he said smoothly. "Some things are worth investing in because they matter." Daniel's expression barely shifted, but something in his eyes darkened. "Is that so?" Harlow sensed an undercurrent between them, something unspoken yet charged. She filed it away, watching as Daniel's polite smile returned. "Well, I look forward to seeing how it all turns out," he said before slipping back into the crowd. Harlow turned to Grayson. "What was that about?" His jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained even. "Daniel and I have different philosophies when it comes to business." She didn't press, but she couldn't ignore the way his posture had shifted ever so slightly. The night continued, conversations blending together, hands shaken, deals hinted at. But through it all, Harlow became increasingly aware of one undeniable truth: Grayson Lancaster was not just an investor. He was a man who carried weight in this world, who people respected, feared, and admired in equal measure. And despite all of that, he had chosen to stand beside her tonight. As the evening wound down, Grayson led her to a quieter part of the balcony overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking, the skyline illuminated in gold and silver. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice softer than before. She glanced at him. "You almost sound surprised." His gaze lingered on her, not surprised. Impressed, something in his tone made her pulse race. She turned back to the view, exhaling. "This world of yours, it's exhausting," he chuckled, a rare sound. "It is." Silence settled between them, charged yet comfortable. Then, without thinking, she asked, "Why did you really buy Bloom and Vine?" He was quiet for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more honest than she had ever heard it. "Because I saw something worth saving." Her chest tightened. She didn't know whether he was talking about the shop, or about her. Harlow hadn't expected Grayson to drive her home himself. Given the luxury car and the way he maneuvered through the city streets with effortless control, she wasn't sure why it surprised her. Maybe because everything about the man screamed efficiency, and personally escorting her home didn't seem like the most practical use of his time. Yet here they were, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. The gala had been a test, one she hadn't realized she was taking until it was over. She'd seen the way people looked at her, assessing, judging. But she hadn't faltered, maybe because Grayson had been by her side, unwavering. The city lights flickered past as she stole a glance at him. He looked different in the quiet of the car, the sharpness of his usual demeanor softened just slightly. The controlled businessman, the man who had walked into her shop and announced he was buying it, wasn't the same one sitting beside her now. When they pulled up in front of her apartment building, he shifted in his seat. Neither of them moved to open the door. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said. She exhaled a quiet laugh. "You already said that. I meant it." His gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. "You're not what they expected." She tilted her head. And what did they expect? Someone who would crumble under the weight of that room. Harlow's lips parted, but she didn't know what to say, because he was right. She had felt the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken question of whether she belonged. And yet, she had stood her ground. She reached for the door handle, but something kept her rooted in place. She should say goodnight, step out, and let the night end. But the air between them felt charged, like something was waiting to happen. Grayson's fingers tapped idly against the steering wheel. "You asked me why I bought Bloom and Vine." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected him to bring it up again. "I told you it was because I saw something worth saving," he continued. "That wasn't the whole truth." Her pulse pounded. "Then what is?" He turned to fully face her, the city lights casting a glow over the hard angles of his face. "I walked into that shop thinking it was just another business, just another investment." His voice was measured, but there was something beneath it, something raw. "But then I saw you." The words settled between them, heavy and unshakable. She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure she could. "I don't make impulsive decisions," he said. "I don't let emotions cloud my judgment, but that day I did." Harlow's hand tightened around the door handle, but she still didn't move. "I've spent my career making calculated choices," he admitted. "But you, Harlow, you were never part of the calculation." Her heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. She should say something, acknowledge what he was telling her, but her words were trapped behind the storm of emotions crashing inside her. Grayson let out a slow breath. "I don't expect you to know what to do with that." She finally found her voice. "I don't." And yet, when she looked at him, really looked at him, she realized something terrifying. She wanted to. She wanted to understand what this was, what it could be, but it was too much, too fast. She pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool night air. For a moment, she thought he might stop her, but he didn't. Instead, he simply watched her go. And for the first time since this all began, Harlow wasn't sure if she was running away from something dangerous or toward something inevitable. The next morning, she arrived at Bloom and Vine earlier than usual. She needed the familiarity of the shop, the comfort of routine. But as she stepped inside, she froze. The space was different. It wasn't drastic, but it was impossible to miss. The shelves had been rearranged, the display cases polished to a gleam. And in the center of the shop, where the usual assortment of seasonal arrangements sat, was something new. A breathtaking arrangement of deep red roses and delicate white gardenias. Harlow's breath caught. She recognized the meaning instantly. Love, new beginnings. She reached out, tracing the edge of a petal with shaky fingertips. "You're here early." She turned sharply. Grayson stood in the doorway, his posture relaxed but his expression unreadable, her heart hammered in her chest. "Did you do this?" His gaze flickered to the arrangement. "I had a few ideas," Harlow swallowed. "This isn't just a business move." "No," he admitted. "It's not." She didn't know how to process it. The man who had swept into her life with sharp suits and ruthless efficiency had just filled her shop with flowers that spoke louder than words ever could. She took a slow step forward. "What are you doing, Grayson?" he exhaled. "Something I probably shouldn't." And then, before she could second-guess, before she could think, she closed the space between them. His breath hitched ever so slightly as she reached up, fingers brushing against the crisp fabric of his suit. "This is dangerous," she murmured. His lips curved ever so slightly. "I know." And then he kissed her. It wasn't tentative, it wasn't hesitant. It was everything that had been building between them, everything unsaid and undeniable. His hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and she melted into the warmth of him, into the certainty of this moment. When they finally pulled apart, the world felt different. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Grayson's forehead rested against hers. "Tell me this isn't a mistake." Harlow's fingers curled against his chest. "It's not." Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of falling, because somehow, without her realizing it, she already had. Harlow wasn't sure how long she stood in the middle of her shop, heart pounding, lips tingling from the force of what had just happened. The world outside continued, as if nothing had changed, cars moving along the street, pedestrians hurrying to their destinations, but inside Bloom and Vine, something had shifted irreversibly. Grayson Lancaster had kissed her, and she had kissed him back. She stepped away, her breath still uneven as reality set in. This wasn't just a stolen moment. This was complicated. This was dangerous. His eyes traced her face as if searching for hesitation, doubt, regret. She wasn't sure what he found, but instead of speaking, he reached for her hand. She let him hold it just for a second, then she pulled away. "We can't do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Grayson's expression didn't change, but something in his posture tensed. "Why not?" "Because this isn't just about us," she said, forcing herself to think clearly. "This is about Bloom and Vine. About everything we've built. I can't afford to let emotions get in the way of that." He studied her, his silence pressing against her like a weight, then he exhaled slowly. "Is that really the reason?" She turned, moving behind the counter and pretending to straighten the display, anything to avoid the intensity of his gaze. "It has to be." The words felt like a lie even as she said them. Grayson didn't push, he simply nodded once, his expression unreadable. Understood. Those two words should have been a relief. Instead, they settled in her chest like a stone. Days passed, and though nothing was said about the kiss, the air between them hummed with unspoken words. Grayson still came by the shop, still assessed the business with his sharp, calculating mind, still offered suggestions that made her bristle even when she knew he was right. But something was different now. The way they stood too close when discussing inventory, the lingering glances when neither thought the other was looking. The way their hands would almost touch when they reached for the same notebook. It was torture, and it only got worse when Alina Hayes called to confirm her order. Harlow had nearly forgotten about the potential deal from the gala, assuming it had been nothing more than polite conversation. But Alina wasn't the kind of woman to waste time on empty words. She wanted Bloom and Vine to handle the floral arrangements for an exclusive event at the city's most prestigious hotel. It was the biggest opportunity the shop had ever had. And it meant working closely with Grayson to make sure everything was perfect. The morning of their meeting at the hotel, Harlow arrived early, nerves buzzing beneath her skin. She had spent hours preparing, selecting the perfect samples, ensuring every detail was flawless. The lobby was a masterpiece of luxury high ceilings, marble floors, and an air of quiet exclusivity. She had barely taken it all in when Grayson appeared at her side. He looked as effortlessly polished as ever in a dark suit, but there was something in his expression she couldn't quite place. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "More than ready." The meeting with Alina was intense, but Harlow held her own, discussing color palettes, flower symbolism, and arrangement placements with the kind of confidence that came from years of experience. Grayson listened, occasionally interjecting with logistical points but never overshadowing her. When the deal was finalized, Alina smiled. "You were right, Grayson," she said. "She's not just talented, she's exceptional." Harlow's breath caught. Grayson didn't look at her. "I don't waste my time on anything less." The words were meant for Alina, but something about them made Harlow's pulse race. As soon as the meeting ended, she stepped outside to catch her breath. The city stretched before her, alive and bustling, but all she could focus on was the man standing beside her. "You didn't have to say that," she murmured. Grayson turned to her. "Say what?" "That you don't waste your time on anything less than exceptional." His gaze flickered over her, sharp and assessing. "But it's the truth." The words sank into her, unraveling the walls she had tried so hard to keep in place. She inhaled sharply. "I don't know what this is, Grayson." "I don't know what we're doing." He stepped closer, his voice low. "Then let me make it simple." And then, before she could stop him, before she could overthink, he kissed her again. This time, she didn't pull away. This time, she let herself fall, because maybe, just maybe, she had been falling all along. Harlow's heart pounded as she pulled away from the kiss, her breath uneven. Grayson's hands lingered at her waist, his grip firm yet hesitant, as if he wasn't ready to let go. The city noise buzzed around them, but in that moment, nothing else existed. She pressed her fingers to her lips, her mind racing. She had spent weeks trying to convince herself that this thing between them was nothing more than tension, an unavoidable side effect of their forced partnership. But this was something real. Something unstoppable. Grayson's gaze never wavered. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something deep, something dangerous. A car pulled up to the curb, momentarily breaking the spell between them. A chauffeur stepped out, nodding at Grayson in silent acknowledgement. Reality came crashing back. Harlow took a step back, smoothing the fabric of her dress as she tried to gather her thoughts. "I should get back to the shop," she murmured. Grayson studied her for a long moment before nodding. Without another word, he opened the back door of the sleek black car, motioning for her to get in. She hesitated. "I can take a cab." He tilted his head slightly, his stance unwavering. "Let me take you home." There was no command in his voice, no expectation, just an offering. And maybe that was why she found herself sliding into the car without another word. The ride was silent but not uncomfortable. The tension between them had shifted, no longer sharp and uncertain, but something warmer, something undeniable. When the car came to a stop in front of her apartment, Harlow turned to him, searching for the right words. But before she could speak, Grayson reached into the inside pocket of his suit and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. She frowned, unfolding it slowly. It was a check for an amount that made her breath hitch. Confusion flickered across her face as she looked up at him. "What is this?" His voice was steady, unwavering. "It's the remainder of the buyout." Her stomach tightened. "What?" "I'm giving Bloom and Vine back to you," he said simply. "Completely, no contracts." "No conditions." Harlow's pulse roared in her ears. "Why?" "Because it was never mine to begin with," he said, his tone softer than she had ever heard it. "And because I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything." She stared at him, her mind struggling to keep up. "Grayson, I don't want this to be about business," he cut in gently. "Not anymore." Her throat tightened. This man, this impossibly frustrating, infuriating, brilliant man was handing back the one thing he had fought so hard to control. He was giving her a choice. She swallowed hard, staring at the check in her hands. She could take it, walk away, pretend that none of this had ever happened. Or Harlow took a slow breath, folding the check neatly before slipping it back into his suit pocket. Grayson stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Harlow, I don't want the money," she said, her voice steady. "I never did." His brows furrowed. "Then what do you want?" She reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "You." Something in his expression cracked, the mask slipping just enough for her to see the vulnerability beneath. And then, without hesitation, he pulled her to him, capturing her lips in a kiss that left no room for doubt. This wasn't just business. This wasn't just a fleeting attraction. This was everything, and neither of them were walking away. 2 months later, Bloom and Vine was thriving in ways Harlow had never imagined. With Grayson's resources and her vision, the shop had expanded, securing exclusive contracts with elite clients, including Alina Hayes. Every day, new customers walked through the doors, drawn by the shop's growing reputation. But more than that, it was still hers. Grayson had kept his promise. He had given her full control, stepping back from the business side of things. He still showed up, of course, often with coffee in hand and an infuriatingly knowing smile. And when the shop closed for the night, he stayed. They had built something together, not just a business, but a partnership, a life. One evening, as she locked up, she turned to find Grayson standing by the door, watching her with that same unreadable expression. "What?" she asked, arching a brow. He stepped closer, reaching into his pocket. For a moment, her heart stuttered. But instead of a check, he pulled out a single, delicate white gardenia, the same flower he had placed in the shop that morning after their first kiss. Her throat tightened. He tucked it behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I love you," he said simply. The words stole the breath from her lungs, settling deep in her chest. She had never been the kind of woman who believed in fairy tales. But standing there in the shop she had fought so hard for, with the man who had somehow become her greatest challenge and her greatest love, she believed in this. She reached up, curling her fingers around his hand. "I love you too." And as he kissed her, surrounded by the scent of fresh flowers and the promise of forever, she knew this was only the beginning.